Hello, my friends. Glad you're joining me today. It's an early live. We don't normally start this early, but it's a lovely afternoon, and it's my Brooklyn apartment. I see that Arthur Porter is already with us. I see that someone named Cornelius Fabian is with us. I see that Itahatis is with us. Glad you're all here. What a lovely day it is. How are folks doing today? Tommy Frost says, hey, Caleb. Well, hey back to you. Yuri, 8674 says, hi, Caleb. Hi, Yuri. Lincolnite Yankee is here, says, comrade. Devon Spawn says, hey, Caleb, love your work. Thank you. Prometheus here. The deaf mute, low called. Don't know what that means, but glad you're with us. We're all having a great time here. It's a lovely afternoon. JT24 is here. The deaf mute says, hello, Caleb. Neon Noir is here. And so is the diet beverage that will not be named. Gentile Cat. Tommy Faras. Ibrahimi Kam. Who else is joining us this lovely afternoon? Andy Janeko is here. Tarkin is here. Hassan Khan. Filthy Kami. Xavier Germenez. Space Communist gives me a super chat and says, good afternoon, comrade. Well, good afternoon to you, Mr. Space Communist. Glad I could make it this week, says Xavier. Glad you're all here. Now is the time, if you haven't done it, to tweet this out. Share it. Stanley Stanlin says he's here. Hey to you. But now is the time, if you haven't already done it, to cut and paste this link on your Facebook status, to tweet this out, to make it a bigger conversation. I know folks want to talk about China, and that is certainly on the agenda. Don't worry, plenty to talk about this week. I don't know if folks saw Trump's recent tweet, but we will definitely be talking China today. Tyler Woodby says, hello, Caleb. Well, hello to you, Tyler. What else is new, folks? We're having a great time today. If you haven't yet subscribed, which I know that roughly 1 in 5 of you have not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button. If you are a subscriber, be sure to click on the bell. Be sure to click on the bell. And another thing is that there are rumors floating around about people being unsubscribed without asking to be unsubscribed. Shout out to Martin O'Connor. Shout out to Authoritarian ML. So make sure that you're still subscribed. Click the bell so that you get notifications. And we are having a lovely day. I am ready to talk to you all. We're having a lovely time. What a lovely day it is. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. So what's on folks' minds today? Yusuf Ali says, what I miss. Well, I don't know what you missed. You may have missed a lot, may have not missed a lot. KJ Mack is asking about Yemen. E. Debs says, drink water. I've got plenty of water too, but I need that caffeine boost. Dante Solano is asking me about Michael Brooks and Hong Kong protests, which we will get to. Steven Schneider is asking about YouTube. Make sure you're still subscribed. Make sure you're getting notifications. Arthur Porter wants to talk about revisionism. Well, we'll put that on the agenda. Thank you for that, Arthur Porter. Good reminder. Oh, boy. What's new, folks? What is new? Amazon Fire. I need caffeine too, says E-Debs. Well, I never could develop a taste for coffee. Never could develop a taste for coffee. Logan Hodge says, good afternoon, Caleb. Good afternoon to you, Logan. Glad you're with us. Some people really just develop that taste for coffee. I was never able to do that. And so as a result, I get my caffeine fix. From Diet Coke, which is probably worse for you than coffee, though the jury's still out. I'm not a health expert. I don't really know. I don't pretend that Diet Coke is healthy because it's not, and we don't mention what it is. It's diet soda. It is not. We don't mention the name because there's no product placement here. Now, Neon Noir is asking me to be sure to take caffeine pills, but there you go. There you go. See, not ready to cross that bridge. I don't even drink energy drinks. I know how much I need the caffeine rush I get from soda, so I'm staying away from energy drinks, staying away from cocaine, staying away from anything that would give me more of a rush than this, because I know how dependent I am on this, and I don't want the train to get any faster, if you know what I'm saying, right? All things in moderation, as they say. I think that's a good way of looking at it. And we all have our vices. Some people smoke cigarettes. Some people drink lots of alcohol and like to get tanked after work. I, on the other hand, spend my afternoons and mornings drinking Diet Coke, and then I stop around 5 every day so I can get to sleep. Now, sometimes if it's a weekend and I'm doing a live, you'll see me drink Diet Coke much later in the day, but that's only on the weekends. I try to limit it, to stop drinking Diet Coke after. I'm just saying the name here, am I? I'm sorry. I try to stop drinking Diet Soda after 5 because I don't want the caffeine to impact my sleep schedule. Right? I want to be able to get to sleep at night. So there you go. Wow, what a lovely day it is. It's a little bit colder today in New York than it has been, which I think is interesting. I think it's very, very interesting. So I'm sure you all have seen that on Twitter, Donald Trump said, "I hereby order our great American corporations to pull out of China." Did folks see that? Donald Trump said on Twitter, "I hereby order our great American corporations to look for alternatives to China, to stop doing business with China." Donald Trump seems to have forgotten that in the United States we live under a system called capitalism. And under the capitalist system, the means of production, the centers of economic power, do not function according to the orders of the state. Instead, they function according to what is most profitable for them. We don't have a command economy. We don't have a centrally planned economy. The government in the United States has no authority to tell companies who they can and cannot do business with. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. Sanctions are imposed on countries. There are regulations that are passed. But the president doesn't have the ability to get up and order people. "I hereby order." Doesn't have that authority in the United States. But what's interesting is that Trump's tweet from yesterday, hereby ordering corporations not to do business with China, it fits a pattern that I've noticed. I think that subconsciously, millions of Americans, I would say subconsciously a majority of Americans, want socialism. I think it's a fact. Polls show that the idea of socialism is more popular than ever, but I think it's even beyond that. I think a lot of the raving anti-communist and anti-socialist people subconsciously, deep down, want socialism. What's Trump doing on Twitter when he gets on Twitter and says, "I hereby order our great American companies"? What he's doing is he's LARPing. Live action role play. LARPing, right? That's when dare I say, nerds put on costumes like characters from Star Trek or Dungeons & Dragons or Battlestar Galactica and pretend to be the characters. Donald Trump is pretending that he is a big authoritarian leader that has the ability to solve America's economic woes. And that is what Americans deep down want. They want someone who will strut into the Oval Office and say, "Amazon, I hereby order you to stop putting local community stores out of business." And Amazon will go, "Yes, sir." They fantasize in their mind that we had a president who could walk in and say, "McDonald's, KFC, I hereby order you to start paying your workers a decent wage." And that the owners of KFC and the owners of McDonald's, the Koch family, the billionaire family that owns McDonald's would go, "Yes, sir," and do it. That's what Americans want. Deep down, they want a government of action that will fight for working families. Let me repeat that. Deep down, what Americans want is a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what Americans want. And especially now that we're in a time of crisis, that's what Americans want. They want a government of action that will fight for working families. And so Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency, hinting that he would be that. He was going to bring the jobs back, blah, 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 blah. Furthermore, now that Donald Trump is in office, he's pretending, he's LARPing, he's live action role-playing as if he is a government of action. He's not. right? I guarantee you that there is not a single corporate boardroom in the United States where that tweet came out and they said, oh my goodness, the president has ordered us to stop doing business with China to look for alternatives. I guess we better do it. Trump said so. He tweeted it out. We better do it. That's what he's... No one cares. They don't care. Now, if the Department of Treasury got involved, and they have, what they're doing to Huawei Corporation and stuff, that they care about. But Trump tweeting out, I hereby order... No. That no one cares about it. Trump's LARPing. It's live action role play, but it points to what I have said time and time again, which is that deep down, subconsciously, millions of Americans want socialism. They want a society in which the economy is not allowed to run rampant, which the greed of the rich is not allowed to be in control, in which the centers of economic power function according to the interests of all society, not just the profits of a few. That's what Americans want. Americans want that. I think all people want that on some level. That's what I think. But hey, I want to take care of some business now before we get back to politics. I know we got plenty to talk about. I will be in Providence, Rhode Island on September 5th. I'm doing a book event at Community Cafe. I've actually been talking with Joel from Community Cafe. Great guy. And Joel has been working with me. We're going to have an event centered around my new book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. And we're going to have an event. And it's near Brown University out there in Providence. And it's going to be a great event. So if you live near Providence, Rhode Island, be there. It's going to be great. And I am excited to see that. I have never been to Rhode Island in my life. But this community cafe, where there's, food banks and community organizing, it sounds like a really great place. This fellow Joel, who's put the event together, sounds like a really great guy. So if you're going to be in Providence, Rhode Island on September 5th, be there, because I'm going to be giving an event at Community Cafe. Hope you can join it. It's going to be a fun evening. Furthermore, if you are in New York City, which some of you I know are, on September 12th, the Fall Class Series put on by some of the students I work with, Students and Youth for a New America, and the Center for Political Innovation, is going to begin. And the opening class, they're having me do the opening class, which will be on the issue of what is scientific socialism. And that's an evening event. That'll be in New York City. That'll be the first class in New York City. So if you're in New York City on September 12th and you want to come to an evening of education, come see the opening class of the Fall Class Series of Students and Youth for a New America and the Center for Political Innovation. It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to it. The next week, we'll be having a class on China. And a lawyer friend of mine who has very much studied Chinese socialism, spent a lot of time in China, he'll be giving a class on Chinese socialism. After that, a friend of mine is going to give a class on the black national question in the United States. There's planning for classes on the Juche ideology. There's planning for classes on Christian socialism and the Christian critique of capitalism. It's going to be a whole fall class series. It'll be on Thursday nights and a lot of classes in the works. And it's a little community here in New York City of people who are interested in learning about socialism and interested in studying and learning from revolutions that have taken place. It's going to be a fun evening. And so that's for those of us in New York City. So if you're in Rhode Island, on September 5th, join us for an evening book event at the Community Cafe. And if you are in New York City, come to some of the Fall Class Series. I'm actually planning a trip to Los Angeles later in the fall. More details on that to come. I know my good friend Ramiro, who's out there, is putting some stuff together. So I'll be on the West Coast. I know we have some West Coast viewers. So yes, a lot in the works. This community that we have, these people, you, me, all of us here who get together once a week to talk about socialism in a rather unorthodox way. We're not conformists. We're not your typical Bernie-crat podcast. We're not sitting here going, these bleeping corporations have too much bleeping power. I don't know if I should vote for Elizabeth bleeping Warren or not. Oh, bleepity, bleepity, bleepity. Trump is a bleeping racist. That's not what we're doing here today. Very different style. Very, very different style. So, For those of us that are part of this growing community of people that tune in every week for these lives, for those of us who like the books that are coming out, for those of us that like the work that we're having here, those of us who are interested in the roots of socialism, wow. Now, Winter Wacko Reborn is asking me about my opinion on the Korea-Japan split and Moon Jae-in. I will get right into that. I was going to talk about that later, but I might as well talk about it now. Folks, Japan is not loved by many people in Asia. There's some exceptions. A lot of people in Taiwan really like Japan. That's about it. People from the Philippines don't much care for Japan. People from China don't much care for Japan. People in Korea, especially, don't care much for Japan. And that would be due to the fact that Japan's legacy in Asia is a legacy of colonialism and eventually economic imperialism. Right? Let's talk about what Japan did in Korea. And thank you for the super chat, Deaf Mute. What did Japan do in Korea? Right? Japan took over Korea. Japan subjugated, economically exploited the Korean people. In 1919, there was a peaceful demonstration against the Japanese occupation of Korea. It was led by Christian ministers, and it was called the White Robe Movement. And these Christian ministers had their followers put on white robes and peacefully march for the independence of Korea. And the response of the Japanese occupiers was to shoot them down, but not only to do that, that wasn't enough to kill the peaceful demonstrators. They then went to a couple elementary schools in Korea and lit them on fire and killed a bunch of elementary school students who had nothing to do with the protests, just in response to the white robe Christian ministers protesting. Right? It was the aftermath of the First World War. Woodrow Wilson had just given his speech talking about the right of nations to self-determination. And so there was this illusion among the Korean people that maybe the international community would understand that Korea had the right to not be colonized and occupied by Japan. So they held their peaceful demonstration led by Christian ministers. The Japanese troops opened fire on the white robe-wearing ministers and Christian protesters. And then after that, they lit a bunch of elementary schools on fire and burned and killed a bunch of elementary school children who had nothing to do with the protest. That was one example of the crimes of Japanese occupation of Korea. Another example is the comfort women. Comfort women. That was basically the use of Korean women as sexual slaves by the Japanese military. Pretty horrendous stuff. Pretty horrendous stuff. So Japan is not very loved in Korea. However, in the aftermath of the Second World War, where you had two governments emerge on the Korean Peninsula, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded on the demand that there not be any rights for Japanese collaborators. The property of Japanese collaborators was seized. Japanese collaborators were banned from the Democratic People's Republic government. However, in South Korea, a lot of the big comprador Japanese collaborators found their way into government. Syngman Rhee, who was the military dictator of South Korea, had ties with Japanese collaborators, and the military governments that existed in the southern half of the Korean Peninsula, a lot of them had Japanese collaborators very high up in the government. People forget that most of South Korea's existence, the South Korean government in the south of Korea, most of the time that government has been a military dictatorship. Whether it was Park Chung-hee, whether it was Syngman Rhee before that, military juntas have ruled South Korea for the majority of the time since the Second World War, and many of those South Korean governments had Japanese collaborators in them. Furthermore, the administration of Lyndon Johnson, and prior to that, the administration of John F. Kennedy. Both worked to facilitate economic ties between Japan and South Korea. For example, the way Park Chung-hee was able to solidify his rule as the military dictator in the late 60s and 1970s, the way Park Chung-hee did it was he created a state-controlled but private steel industry called POSCO, P-O-S-C-O, POSCO. And the way he did it was that the Lyndon Johnson administration basically forced Japan to lend the money to South Korea to create this quasi-government-controlled steel industry. So facilitating Japanese investment in Southern Korea has been a key sticking point of U.S. foreign policy, right? The USA is aligned with Japan against China and against North Korea. So it was very important to make sure that there was some kind of mending of economic relationship between Japan and South Korea. However, just like in North Korea, people in South Korea know very well about the comfort women. They know about the White Robe Massacre. The fact that people in South Korea are Christians itself is a result of opposition to Japan. Japan's religion was Shintoism, and so converting to Christianity was a way to reject the Japanese occupation. That's why Christianity is so big in Southern Korea, and in Northern Korea too, there's Christianity. And so there is just no love for Japan among Koreans. And the fact that now the government of Moon Jae-in is responding to moves by the government of Japan. Let's remember that Japan imposed economic sanctions on South Korea. So now we have the government of Moon Jae-in escalating it, and we're seeing the beginning of a mini trade war between South Korea and Japan. But people are missing the biggest factor in all of this, China. South Korea trades a huge amount with China. So much so that when Park, the previous president, unloaded the missiles from the Terminal High Altitude Defense System, the THAAD missile system, right, when that happened, China took economic moves to punish South Korea for that, and it was big. It was dramatic, and it caused big problems. And Moon Jae-in is much more critical of the United States, and he's much more friendly to China. And that has opened the door for him to not allow Japan to kick them around. Japan wants to put economic sanctions on them? Fine. Well, they'll take measures of their own. There is an emerging trade war between South Korea and Japan. But really, what's underlying it is that South Korea is much more independent, and South Korea is much more economically tied to China. They are not an economic colony of the United States. They are not an economic colony of Japan. They have their own economic base, and they have made a decision to get closer and closer to China economically, mainly because China does a better deal with them, it's them better, and also because South Korea's economy has a lot of technology in it, right? Telecommunications. And China is leading the way to become the world's, next cyber telecommunications, center. And that is what the United States is really mad about. Made in China 2025 is a program in which the Chinese government is pouring huge amounts of money into scientific research, R&D, research and development, technological breakthroughs, artificial intelligence. And that infuriates Wall Street, right? China is on its way to becoming the next tech hub, the cutting-edge tech hub of the world. The Chinese government, which is a socialist government, it's not a capitalist government, it's able to think long-term and strategically. It operates on the basis of what is good for the country as a whole, for the population. It's not thinking in terms of what just makes a lot of profits for big corporations. The state-controlled economy of China is pouring huge amounts of research into technology and into science and into making cutting-edge breakthroughs. You should see some of these tech campuses that they've got in places like Shenzhen. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. My apologies to Chinese speakers that are listening. But in these model cities that were first built by Deng Xiaoping, in the Saigon new area that was built, is now being built by President Xi, I mean, the amazing things they're doing in China. Right now, in the Saigon new area, in China, this model city being built by President Xi, they have what's called a future hotel. It's called the Future Hotel. And at the Future Hotel, you can just walk into the hotel and go right to your room. Why? Because the facial recognition technology notices you don't have to go to the front desk, you don't have to show ID, you make a reservation, you show up at the hotel, and you go to your room, period. The facial recognition technology lets you into your room. The facial recognition technology checks you in and checks you out. It is a future hotel without hotel workers. That is what China is doing. That's the kind of thing they're doing. Can you imagine a hotel in the United States where you could just walk in? You make your reservation online, you show up, you just walk in, right? That's what China is doing. And it's not the only thing that they're doing. And they've stated it. Peter Navarro, Tim Leitheiser, all these White House Trade Council guys have stated that what sticks in their craw, what gets them mad, is Made in China 2025. They cannot stand the fact that China is pouring so much money into research and development. Why? Here in the United States, we don't do that. We did that at one point. Roosevelt was very much into funding universities. And Vannevar Bush, who was kind of a thinker who was associated with the Roosevelt administration, also kind of had this idea that in order to make capitalism work, it was necessary to have a huge state sector that funded technological research. Well, that kind of thinking is out in the United States. In the United States, we believe in neoliberalism now. We believe in unregulated everything. The government should spend money on nothing but tanks and bombs and drones, right? Neoliberal economic theories, the theories of Adam Smith, the theories of Ayn Rand, the theories of Friedrich von Hayek, the theories of Milton Friedman, of Alan Greenspan, say the government shouldn't fund new scientific research. The government shouldn't fund technology research. The government should stay out, keep its hands off, and let the private sector work its magic. Let capitalism work its magic. And as a result, Americans, in terms of science and math, our schools are a joke. I mean, our test scores compared to any other Western country are abysmal. We've let our public school system completely rot because those teachers' unions, we don't like them. We're setting up charter schools that in many cases are less effective, right? Now, they always highlight the high-performing charter schools, the magnet schools or whatnot. But your overall, charter schools are not much better than public schools. In some cases, they're often worse. Basically, we've given up on advancing science and technology, right? Silicon Valley, what do? They import engineers and tech scientists and others. They import them from other countries. That's what they do. So we've gutted our educational system here in the United States. We've stopped funding scientific research. The government funding of scientific research has drastically decreased. And as a result, China is doing the opposite, and they're moving ahead. And China has said they want it to be a joint operation. No one ever talks about this, but China has said it wants Made in China 2025 to be a joint operation. It wants both sides to be involved. It wants American universities to team up with Chinese universities. It wants American companies and telecommunications companies and their tech labs to team up with Huawei and other Chinese corporations to work together on it. That's the idea. However, that's not what Tim Leitheiser and Peter Navarro want. That's not what Steve Bannon wants. They want a trade war with China. They say, no, we're not doing it in the United States because that's socialism. When the government funds scientific research, we can't have that. That's socialism. It's communism. It's full-blown communism, right? If the government writes a check to a foundation to do research, that's the next thing you know, we're going to be in Stalin's gulag, right? That's what they're saying on Fox News. So we can't do it here. We can't have the state try and make the economy better. No. Can't do that. But China's doing it, and that's unfair. It's unfair. It's an unfair trade practice for China to do what we should be doing over here. China manages their economy better because it's a state-controlled economy, because it's a command economy, because the means of production are operated according to what's good for society and not merely what's good for profits. So China is developing in technology. We don't do it over here, and then we punish China for doing what we won't do. It is the dumbest policy you've ever heard, right? But it's rooted in pessimism. Pessimism, right? There's no hope for the future, right? So rather than trying to advance ourselves, we punish those who advance, and we stop progress over here, and then we punish people around the world who advance progress, right? Whether it's the left or the right, pessimism. Pessimism seems to be the order of the day in the United States and coming out of the Western world. Wall Street and London are pessimistic. The world is advancing too fast. Countries that used to be poor, impoverished, captive markets are now advancing and industrializing. We can't have that. Pretty soon, Wall Street and London will lose their place at the top of the world economy. History must stop. That's what they believe. That is what Wall Street and London believe. History must stop so that we can stay ahead. That's, imagine a football game. And instead of having a clock ticking down the quarters and the halves and the game ending at an agreed upon time, they announce the game ends when this team is ahead. That's what Wall Street is doing, right? They're ahead right now. But they see the rise of socialism in Eurasia. They see the glowing Eurasian alternative on the global economy. And they realize they're not going to be ahead much longer. So they're announcing, game over. The game ends right now because we're ahead. Right? And the United States is still ahead. And London Stock Exchange is still ahead. They're ahead right now. But they ain't going to be ahead forever, because socialism is much more efficient than capitalism, and capitalism is a highly inefficient system. And we're already seeing the consequences of why high-tech and free markets don't work hand in hand, like the fact Amazon is putting out of business all these stores throughout the United States, like the fact that wages are dropping because workers are becoming far, far more easily replaceable, right? When you have a for-profit economy, greater abundance and advances in technology, greater efficiency in production leads to greater poverty. And so you have a mess. And that's what the 2008 financial crisis was about. And that's what the financial crisis on the horizon is about. Think about self-driving cars. Right? That's what's going on here. And so Wall Street and London is realizing that while we have a free market capitalist system in which technology leads to all kinds of contradictions and problems, and our society is coming apart, and all of these problems are developing because of the rule of profits, in Eurasia, and in the rising alternative on the global economy, where the state controls the means of production, where the president actually does have the ability to say, I order these corporations to do this, and they do it, where there is a central planned economy, these countries continue to move ahead. They're continuing to advance. And pretty soon, Wall Street is not going to be in the lead anymore, especially if we can get out of fossil fuels, if we get out of oil, if oil no longer becomes the basis for the economic order of the world, then Wall Street has lost the game, because that's how they rule. They have cornered the oil markets. The big banks are oil banks. So they are trying to announce that the game is over. They're trying to call the game because they're ahead. Right? I think there was a rule at one point when I played soccer in high school that if there was lightning, they had to end the soccer game. And if you were in the second half of the soccer game, the team that was ahead when the lightning came won. Now, if you're in the first half, the game just didn't count. But if you're in the second half of the game, and you see the lightning, the referee sees the lightning, in the second half, then the team that's ahead gets the game. And right now, Wall Street is saying, oh boy, I see a lot of lightning in the sky. Guess we got to call the game. No one's allowed to develop. No one's allowed to advance. China is not allowed to fund technology. We're ahead. We're ahead right now. So history and human progress must end so we can stay on top of the world. And that's not how history works. History doesn't stop. If you try to stop history, you're going to have a lot of problems, because history does not stop. There's one thing we've learned about human beings, how we've gone from hunter-gatherers to slavery and feudalism to the modern capitalist economy to the beginnings of socialism that we have seen. Humanity does not stop. Humans do not stop. They don't. Look how many people die trying to get into the United States. Human beings have a will to survive. Look how many people, these refugees that get on rafts and do all the amazing things these people do to try and get a better life. People don't stop. The drive of human beings to survive, the drive of human beings to build a better life, to advance, is one of the most powerful things we have ever seen. I'm talking to you now from an iPhone. Think about that. This iPhone is made out of dirt and rocks. We're a species that has taken dirt and rocks and turned it into iPhones and iPads. Right? No other species has done what human beings have done. And if you want history to stop, I mean, maybe you should ask the Easter Bunny to stop it, right? Maybe Santa Claus will stop it. Maybe the Tooth Fairy will stop it. But history is not going to stop. It's not going to stop. And the more you try to stop history, the more problems you're going to have. Wow. We have talked about a lot of things, folks. What is on your mind? Matt Angelo says, how will we limit ourselves from consuming everything? I'm being asked about Lukashenko. You know, I've read about Lukashenko, and I know he's done a lot of good things in terms of the economy. I know that you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of those Eastern European former Soviet republics were just obliterated economically. But Lukashenko's government has taken big measures to protect people, and I think that's a good thing, personally. You know, I know that there's some corruption in Belarus. And I know that there have been disagreements between Belarus and Russia, and so I don't know enough about that. But I do know that the Lukashenko government has done a lot to really protect the living standards of the people, to raise living standards, and to keep going. And I think that's a good thing. I really do. But what else is on people's minds? I know there's a lot on people's minds. If you're just joining us now is the time to tweet this out, to cut and paste the link, put it on your Facebook, put it on your Twitter. If you haven't subscribed, now is the time to subscribe. Make sure you're still subscribed. Hit the notifications button. Wow, we are having a great time today. We are having a great time today. What is new, folks? What is new? Shout out to Jason Dunn. Glad you're with us, Jason. Hello to you as well. Now, I know it's all over the internet and all over Republican media that this Bernie Sanders called for nationalizing the energy industry in the United States. Actually, he didn't. If you look at what he said, he actually didn't say that. What he said was he wanted to create a government-controlled apparatus of wind power and solar panels that would be controlled by the government. All right, and basically, kind of like the Tennessee Valley Authority that Roosevelt established, he called for clean energy under state control. He wanted the government to go out and build a bunch of windmills and solar panels. So why is it that I'm seeing all over Republican Twitter that Bernie Sanders wanted to nationalize oil, wanted to nationalize natural gas? Why am I seeing that? Because he didn't say that. Did not say that. His Green New Deal proposal, his new climate proposal, just simply called for government control of windmills. Basically, the government building a bunch of windmills. So why am I seeing all these big Republicans tweeting out, oh my God, Bernie Sanders wants the government to control the energy industry. All the energy firms are going to be controlled by the government. This is communism. We can't have this. Oh my God. Why am I seeing this? Because that's not what he said. Well, the reason you're seeing this is because everybody knows that's common sense. Right now, the United States is in the middle of an oil and gas boom, producing more oil and gas than ever before in history. But the people getting rich from our oil and from our natural gas have names like Rockefeller and Carnegie and DuPont and Koch. And as a result of that, the country is getting poorer while we produce more energy before. And what's going on right now is shale. What's going on with the shale movement? I got a super chat asking me about the Chinese dolphins. I don't know anything about that. But what's going on with the shale markets right now could potentially crash the entire economy. The price of oil keeps dropping. They're not paying back their loans. I talked about that in a previous live. So why is it that we're having an energy boom, but the country's getting poorer? It's because the energy that's being produced, the oil and the gas being pulled out of the shale, is owned privately by capitalists and managed according to make profits for capitalists, not in a rational way. And it's common sense, and they know it's coming. They know it's coming. that people are going to wake up and say, why in the world is America's oil and America's gas and America's timber and America's coal operating to make profits for a small group of billionaire bankers and not for the average Americans? They know it's coming. Americans are going to want to nationalize their natural resources. Bernie Sanders didn't even call for it, and already they're screaming loudly. They're screaming loudly because they know that that's the rational thing to do. At this point, the United States is exporting huge amounts of oil, but yet we're still importing from Saudi Arabia. Yet we're still importing from Nigeria. That doesn't make any sense, right? We're dependent on foreign imports at the same time that we're exporting. Why? Because we have the big four super majors, and we have all the tiny little fracking companies, and they're competing with each other, and it's highly, highly irrational. State control of oil and gas and coal and timber and other natural resources is going to start making a lot more sense. It's common sense if you look at it. There's no reason. The way the energy markets are functioning right now, on the verge of crashing the USA economy, is pretty stupid. And everyone knows that. It would make sense for the state to control the oil, for the state to control the natural gas. That would make sense. It would make sense. And they know that it would make sense. And because of that, because they know that it would make sense, they're very scared. You know, David Koch, one of the Koch brothers, just died. You know, the Koch brothers, there was a big, hysteria about them. They were the conservative boogeymen that the Obama-aligned media really demonized. Rachel Maddow doubled down on them. The Koch brothers, the Koch brothers, they're just these greedy oil capitalists, and they were foreign policy hawks, but they promoted Ayn Rand's writings. They were, quote unquote libertarians, but they were free market right wing fellows. The Koch brothers, one of them just died. But what is often unstated about the Koch brothers is that their father, Fred Koch, got his wealth from the Soviet Union. Bet you didn't know that, right? Fred Koch was a chemist in the United States who developed his own method of thermal cracking, which is how you turn gasoline, or how you turn petroleum oil into gasoline. And he developed his own method of doing it, and it was much more efficient than what the major oil companies in the USA were doing. So they took him to court. They tried to put him out of business, Fred Koch. And he was just kind of economically ruined. Why? Because his method of developing and thermal cracking was more efficient, right? Capitalism rewards efficiency, right? Well, no, it didn't, actually. So where did Fred Koch go to implement his new method of thermal cracking that he invented? The Soviet Union. Fred Koch went to the Soviet Union, and he ran the oil industry for the Soviet Union during the 5-year plans period of Stalin, when the Soviet Union really expanded its oil production apparatus. Under the Tsar, the only real oil fields in the USSR under the Tsar were in Azerbaijan, in the oil fields of Azerbaijan. But under Stalin, Russia vastly expanded its oil production apparatus, and Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, was hired by the Soviet government and allowed to have a joint venture with the Soviet government during the 5-year plans to help the development of the Soviet oil industry. Yes, the Koch brothers, the millionaire, billionaire, right-wing extreme capitalists, got their wealth because socialism works. And that apparently was the basis for Fred Koch being such an anti-communist, as he saw socialism working so effectively. He was terrified that socialism and communism would come to take over the United States because he himself witnessed how effective it was in transforming the Soviet Union from being an impoverished agrarian society into being a modern industrial economy. Now, Fred Koch also did business with Nazi Germany, from what I understand, but he did business mainly in the Soviet Union, and he saw how efficient the Soviet system was. He saw how a huge state-run oil production apparatus was created by the Soviet government. He was impressed with it, and he was blown away, and it made him fear that eventually the means of production would be seized by the workers in the United States because this system was more efficient. So there you go. all the stuff Fred Koch and all of them said about socialism doesn't work and all of that, their wealth is based on the fact that it didn't. If it didn't work, if socialism was incapable of building a huge state-run oil production apparatus, Fred Koch would never have become a millionaire because of his joint venture with the Soviet Union. So their very wealth was proof that their free market ideology and their rhetoric denying the accomplishments of socialism was false. Now, Fred Koch thought of himself as a Howard Rourke. He was a great man who'd invented something, he was being persecuted, but it was capitalism that was persecuting him. And it was socialism that harnessed his talent. It was a socialist government that said, this is more efficient, we don't care what the market says, and hired him. Capitalists are non-ideological. They will cooperate with anyone, points out reluctant modernist. And that's very, very true, right? There's an expression, it's attributed to Lenin, I don't know if it's true. They say that when you go to hang a capitalist, he will sell you the rope. I don't know if that's really said by Lenin or if it's just something attributed. There's a lot of false quotes out there. But there you go. And he wasn't the only capitalist in the United States who made a lot of money due to the Soviet economic boom. Armand Hammer was in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, I believe, he was a wealthy American businessman who made a lot of money trading with the Soviet Union. There were many American capitalists who saw trading with the Soviets as a way to do business. And actually, oddly enough, the boom of Nazi Germany had a lot to do with the fact that the Soviet Union was right on their border. And the Soviet Union's demand for supplies and their ability to sell increased. And the Nazi government in Germany did a lot of business with the Soviet government. They were bloodthirsty enemies ideologically. Eventually you had the Second World War. But part of the Nazi boom in the early 1930s, the early years of the Nazi state, was their trading with the Soviet Union. Again, people don't discuss that. But what else is new, folks? I really do believe. Oh, someone's asking me, Prometheus, what is the socialist position in the upcoming elections? Well, I stay away from that kind of thing because I'm a journalist. I don't endorse any candidate. There are some candidates who say things I like. There are some candidates who say things I really don't like. Not a fan of Kamala Harris. I am a fan of some of what Bernie Sanders says. I am a fan of some of what Tulsi Gabbard says, especially about foreign policy. I'm a fan of Andrew Yang and his warning about the dangers of automation. Not sure I agree with his call for universal basic income. I think it's very interesting. I like a lot of different things that are said by different candidates, and there are some candidates I particularly don't care for. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, not a fan. But that's where I'm at, and I don't endorse any candidate. I'm not here to campaign for anyone. Let me be absolutely clear about that. I did want to mention, though, that when Donald Trump gets on Twitter and says, I hereby order our great American corporations, people are pointing out that that's populism. Populism, right? It's that he's standing up for the average American, he's standing up for the little guy against the big corporations, that's populism. And populism, I think, is a good thing. And actually, if you look at the roots of the term populism, if you look at the roots of populism in the United States, it's very interesting. There was a People's Party in the United States at one point, the Populist Party, or the Populists they were referred to. And their history is very interesting. So, the Republican Party, first we got to back up, right? Originally, we had the Democrats and the Whigs, right? Those were the two parties originally in the United States. And, the Democrats were Andrew Jackson, started by Thomas Jefferson, Tammany Hall, New York. And then the Whigs were the other party. Eventually, the Democrats more and more became the party of slavery and the southern plantation owners. And the Whigs became very confused about what they were about. And eventually, you had the founding of the Republican Party in the United States, the birth of the Republican Party. And a lot of former Whigs joined it, but a lot of radical abolitionists joined it as well. A lot of them. And the slogan of the Republican Party, when it began, was free land, free labor, and free men. Free land meant letting people go further west and get more land, seize it from the Native Americans, not good. Free labor meant no slavery. And free men also meant no slavery. And it was the party of small farmers originally, the free soilers they were called, who didn't want slave states. They wanted the new states that were coming in the United States to be non-slave states by non-slave owning small farmers. That was the base of the Republican Party. It was the party of small farmers who were opposed to slavery. And eventually the labor unions got involved. Why did the labor unions get involved? Well, because if you're trying to get a higher wage for your workers, having them compete with people who don't get paid at all, you can see why organized labor, the Knights of Labor they were called, this was before the AFL was founded, I believe. People like Samuel Gompers, the Knights of Labor, these early trade unionists, they were also aligned with the Republican Party. You had very radical Christians who were abolitionists, right? Like the Mormons early on, like the Seventh-day Adventists early on, like the many different Christian groups. John Brown, others, they were in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party was originally a left-wing radical party. And actually the name Republican, right? Now, nowadays, what does Republican mean? It means you want an elected government, you want representative government, you want a republic, maybe you believe in Plato in ancient Greece. Back then, it meant something very different, because in 1848, there were over 200 different revolutions in Europe in 1848. And what were all the people who went out and fought in the streets in Germany and Czechoslovakia and France and Britain and all these places? What were they called? Republicans. Republicans, right? Those were the uprisings taking place across Europe. The people, standing on the barricades. You ever see Les Miserables? Those people standing on the barricades, waving red flags, saying, "Do you hear the people say?" They were called Republicans. So for the Republican Party in the United States to call itself the Republican Party was a very big political statement. They were saying, we're the party of the French Revolution. We're the party of the German Revolution of 1848. We're the party of the Hungarians. We're the party of the British. We're the party of all these people in Europe that are rising up and saying, down with the kings, elected leaders, universal male suffrage. Right? Karl Marx was part of the 1848 uprising in Germany. That's why the Communist Manifesto was written. The Communist League was a faction in the 1848 German uprising. Marx and Engels were running around in their 20s like Che Guevara with muskets and rifles, fighting to create a modern German nation state, a democratic republic in Germany, and they failed, and they fled the country because they had participated in a violent revolution to try and create a German government, a German central government, right? So the Republican Party, when they began, as the party of small farmers who didn't like slavery, the party of labor unions, the party of Christian abolitionists, eventually also the party of industrialists and factory owners, they were a radical left-wing coalition. They were Republicans. And who did they select as their leader, as their spokesperson? Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, where was he from? He was from Illinois, which at that point was unsettled. That was the Wild West back at that time. And they even had they played up the idea that Abraham Lincoln was someone born in a log cabin, right? It was a log cabin. That's what he was born in a log cabin. He was, a guy who grew up poor and became a lawyer, and they even had a song. Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness, came up from the wilderness, came up from the wilderness. Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness. They played up the idea that Abraham Lincoln was a common man. He was from the Wild West. And the Republican Party, when it began, was a very, very left-wing political upsurge. It was a left-wing movement. They were not socialists and communists. There were socialists and communists in it, but they were not. They were largely just a group of people who really opposed slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was the leader of them. And he was portrayed as the people's guy. He was from Illinois, and he was a radical. You should read some of the things he said in the Lincoln-Douglas debate. Abraham Lincoln, he talked about the love of labor unions. He said, "Thank God we live in a country where men have the right to strike," which back then, when most states had a law against going on strike, was a pretty radical statement to make. The Republican Party, when it first moved into getting elected, was at that point a very, very radical left-wing party. It was a mass upsurge. It was a popular upsurge. The wealthy slave plantation owners of the South, The bankers of Wall Street that made their money insuring those ships that sent cotton to Britain and were tied in with the Atlanticist British system, right? You know, Wall Street, the Southern plantation owners, London, they didn't like Lincoln. But there was a faction in the United States, factory owners, abolitionists, small farmers, labor unionists, free African Americans who wanted to abolish slavery, people like Frederick Douglass, activists. All of them were united in rejecting the slave system. And they made compromises. Abraham Lincoln said he didn't want to abolish slavery. He just didn't want any more slave states. He didn't want the U.S. government to accommodate slavery and enforce the fugitive slave law. He said, fine, you southern states, you can have slavery. You can have slavery. But we're not going to play ball with it, right? He was not an abolitionist, mind you. And there were some radical abolitionists who didn't quite care for Lincoln. They said he didn't go far enough. Lincoln got elected, and immediately after he got elected, that was enough. The slaveholders declared independence. We had a big, huge civil war, and Abraham Lincoln tried. He admits that he tried to not abolish slavery during the war, but he ultimately had to abolish slavery in order to win the war. And it was a revolution. It was the Second American Revolution. It is the most radical revolution we've had in U.S. history. All throughout the South, slaves stopped working in a general strike, basically. What else happened? Harriet Tubman. You've learned about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, but you didn't learn that Harriet Tubman was the first woman to lead U.S. soldiers into battle. And in South Carolina, she had an armed militia of former slaves that went from plantation to plantation, killing slave owners and freeing slaves along the Combahee River in South Carolina. You didn't learn that in school. Bet you didn't learn that there was a communist force, a communist division of the U.S. Army during the U.S. Civil War called the Ohio 9th Regiment. It was German immigrants, people not born in the United States, Germans who believed in communism, like August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer. And they came over and they formed the communist, division. They waved the red flag as they marched into battle. It was a revolution in a dramatic sense. And Abraham Lincoln, all this stuff, they talk about authoritarianism and all of that. Abraham Lincoln got rid of habeas corpus. He outlawed slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. There are a couple guys in Washington, D.C. who tried to keep selling slaves in violation of the law, and he hanged them, executed them. Very authoritarian, all the, quote-unquote authoritarian. It was a radical revolution. And ultimately, it resulted in the overturning of the slave system. It's probably the most radical revolution we've seen here. You think the Civil Rights Movement was radical? Look back at the Civil War. You think that the anti-Vietnam War movement was radical? Look back at the Civil War. You think that the movement for organized labor later was radical? Well, look back at the Civil War. We have never seen anything that radical, right? The American Civil War was a broad, sweeping uprising. It was an explosion of Americans demanding that slavery be abolished. And it wasn't the North versus the South. It was people all over the country, enslaved Africans. Read about the Free State of Jones. There's a great movie, The Free State of Jones, about white people in the South who refused to go along with slavery and had an uprising to oppose slavery in the South. There is a whole history, right? It's the Second American Revolution. Don't call it the Civil War. Call it the Second American Revolution, because that's what it was. That's what it was, the Second American Revolution. Very dramatic moment. After the Second American Revolution, the Republican Party became divided. There were the industrial capitalists, industry was expanding at that point. Textile mills were opening up in places like New Jersey, places like Salem, Massachusetts, and industrial capitalism in the United States was expanding. But those free soilers, those small farmers, were still around. And they increasingly felt like the Republican Party was becoming the party of rich industrialists and not the party of the small farmers. So they broke away and they formed the People's Party. And they were called the Populists. The Populists, they were called, the People's Party. And they called for the nationalization of all the railroads. They didn't like the fact that the big railroad companies were getting all the land and doing all the awful things and working people to death, building the railroads and all that. They formed They demanded the government control the railways. They demanded government control of a lot of the new technology that was coming in there. They wanted a government-run bank that would control lending money. They were the populists, the party of the small farmers. And, the early labor movement activists were part of the populist upsurge. Daniel De Leon, the Marxist in the United States, was part of it. The People's Party. It was a mass uprising in the United States. And they targeted what they called the monopolists. Monopolists. Big corporations that dominate the economy. They were against the big monopolies and the trusts, they were called. They were against the trusts and the big monopolies. And what people don't talk about is that originally the People's Party was against racism. The People's Party argued that racism was a tool to divide the people of the United States. And they noticed that whenever there was a big political upsurge, they used the fear of black people and the fear of quote-unquote black supremacy. They used that to stop every mass upsurge of the working class and the small farmers. And the populists were originally anti-racist, and they were a mass upsurge demanding the nationalization of big things. They basically were demanding a government of action to protect the small farmers, to protect the factory workers. They were not socialists. There were socialists among them, but they were not. Daniel De Leon and others were around, eventually Eugene Debs, but they were not socialists, mostly. They were populists. They were populists. However, unfortunately, I shouldn't just say unfortunately, but the deep tragedy was that the populist coalition was ripped apart by racism. The Democrats, they're the opposition party, discovered that amid this upsurge demanding justice from the industrial capitalists, amid this demand that the government stop serving monopolies, the Democrats discovered that they could appeal to low-income white workers on the basis of racism. And so the Democrats increasingly started to recruit among the populists, right? Eventually you had William Jennings Bryan, who was a big populist, well-known populist activist. He became the Democratic Party's nominee for president. And William Jennings Bryan was a racist. And the Democrats increasingly discovered that as low-income white workers were getting mad at the government and monopolies, that the Democrats could start talking about, well, the government employs black people and not white people. That's a waste of our money. And and increasingly accused the Republican Party of being too sympathetic to African Americans, not sympathetic to white people. And as the People's Party became more and more racist, it eventually merged into the Democratic Party. Deep tragedy, very deep tragedy. And that's basically what happened to the populist movement, is it became dominated by racism and eventually moved into the Democratic Party. And eventually Woodrow Wilson, used racism as his political football, basically. He made the movie Birth of a Nation, the first full-length movie in history, which was a racist propaganda film retelling the history of the Civil War, making it look like white people benefited from slavery and that the Republicans had been a party that hated the white people and it was awful. It's one of the deepest tragedies, the populist movement, which was beginning to almost become a socialist movement. Socialists were part of it. The movement against the trusts was co-opted because of racism. And eventually, the populists moved into the Democratic Party, William Jennings Bryan and others. Fascinating story, very, very fascinating story. And that's the history of populism in the United States. But oddly, because of the fact that the Democratic Party was the party of the South and the Democratic Party had absorbed the populists, you had weird things that happened. For example, Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana during the Great Depression. I love Huey Long. Huey Newton is named after Huey Long. Huey Long was a Democrat in Louisiana who began as an anti-KKK Democrat. And he aligned with the Roman Catholics who were being discriminated against by the Ku Klux Klan in Louisiana. And his mentor was a member of the Socialist Party who taught him everything he knew, an older guy that he befriended. He was a lawyer, small-town lawyer. Huey Long, very good orator and speaker, and he aligned with the Catholics against the Klan, eventually got himself elected to be the governor of Louisiana. And as governor, he arranged for the first black women to be hired as nurses. He expanded literacy. He wiped out illiteracy in the state of Louisiana, not just for white people, but for black people as well. Even though the Jim Crow system was in effect, Huey Long was seen as a friend of the African American community, so much so that Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panthers, is named after him. And if you read Huey Newton's book, Revolutionary Suicide, in that book, he praises Huey Long astoundingly. Huey Long, he came into office and realized that the African American community, the white community of Louisiana, everybody in Louisiana was being just, screwed over by Standard Oil Company, which was the Rockefellers, right? Louisiana, very poor state, has a lot of oil. And who was making all the profits from it? It was people like the Rockefellers. So Huey Long started taxing the Rockefellers for every oil barrel transaction. Every amount of oil that they refined, they had to pay a tax. And with that huge amount of money, he built a huge government apparatus. And he hired the unemployed people. He built bridges all across the state. He built roads all across the state. He built his own private army that was like his own security force. He printed a government-controlled newspaper. And basically, with control of the oil profits, Louisiana in the 30s became Venezuela. It was petrosocialism. It was the government controlling the oil profits and using it to therefore control the economy. Fascinating stuff. Huey Long wiped out illiteracy in the state, hired the unemployed, and basically got to the point that he controlled the economy. There were private businesses, but they all did what Huey Long said. They called him the Kingfish, and it was a mass movement, and it wanted to go national. He built the Share Our Wealth clubs. And all across the country, people loved him. He was in the U.S. Senate. He gave speeches, and he called it Share the Wealth, the Share the Wealth movement, right? Huey Long. And Huey Long was a result of the fact that the Democratic Party of the Jim Crow South had absorbed the populists. Huey Long's mentor had been a member of the Socialist Party who'd been a populist and never joined the Democrats. And, Huey Long, unfortunately, now, you have to remember, Roosevelt had an alliance with Standard Oil. Huey Long was against Standard Oil. So Huey Long hated Roosevelt and vice versa. And eventually Huey Long was assassinated. He was shot on the Capitol steps. Very famous. And many people suspect that it was allies of Roosevelt that shot Huey Long because Roosevelt, was going to run for president in 1936. And Huey Long was going to run against him on the Share Our Wealth ticket. And so people suspect that maybe the Roosevelt administration was involved. There's no clear evidence of that. That's one thing many Huey Long supporters believed. But, when he was shot on the Capitol steps in Louisiana, there was a song composed. I kid you not. Oh, they shot Huey Long in Louisiana as he walked down the Capitol steps. Yes, they shot Huey Long in Louisiana, where he took on the capitalists. Everyone knew that Huey Long was a left-winger. All the cartoons in the newspaper would put a hammer and sickle behind him. All the media that didn't like him in Louisiana accused him of being too friendly to African Americans, being too anti-racist, and being a Bolshevik and being a communist. He denounced communism up and down. He said, you got to vote for me. I'm Huey Long. I'm the only answer to communism. If you don't vote for me, if we don't have Share Our Wealth, there's going to be a communist revolution. So he played up the idea that he wasn't a communist, and the only way to stop communists was to vote for him, because if not, the gap between the rich and poor would get bigger, and you'd have Bolshevik revolution. Very clever way of arguing things. But Huey Long was a populist. He was moving Louisiana towards socialism. He was shot. And it was a real tragedy. But again, politics is more complicated than people make it out to be. And the notion among liberal circles right now that populism is inherently bad, that's a very, very dangerous notion. I don't like that notion, because populism is the basis of socialism. Populism is the basis of leftism in general. Populism means you're for the people against the ruling class. That's what it means. And being a populist is a good thing. And in fact, the word Bolshevik, someone mentioned this, and I talk about this in my new book. So the word Bolshevik in Russia, all right, it means majority group. The Bolsheviks were the majority group in Russia. That's what that means. But, and here's where it gets complicated. The reason that the Bolsheviks were called the majority group was because Lenin called this meeting of Russian revolutionaries in exile, pitched the idea of forming his party of a new type, and the majority of the people in the room joined with Lenin. They were the Bolsheviks, the majority group, and the minority didn't join with Lenin. They were called the minority group, or the Mensheviks. However, to your average Russian in 1917, the Bolsheviks' name just meant majoritarians. They were the majority party, the majoritarian group. And to your average Russian, their name sounded a lot like populist. They were for the majority. The workers and peasants were the majority of Russia, and they were for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. So the Bolsheviks were really populists, more or less. That's what they were known as. Thank you, Larry Chu. I'm glad you like what I'm doing here. The Bolsheviks were populists. The Bolsheviks of Russia were the populist party of Russia. They were for the workers and peasants. They were the majoritarians. That's what Russian, in Bolshevik in Russian means majoritarian. And that's what the Bolsheviks were. They were the majoritarian party. They were the party that fought for the people, for the population, for the majority. They were the popular party. They were the people's party of Russia. They believed in Marxism-Leninism. They understood dialectical materialism and the science of socialism. But they were the people's party. Their name to the average Russian meant majoritarians. That's what they were known as. Let's be real about it. If the Bolsheviks had been anti-populist, if they had insisted, no, we're not the majoritarian party, we're the worker party, we are the scientist, no one would have listened to them. Just saying. What's new, folks? What's on your mind today? Now, someone's talking about how the social revolutionaries, the Narodniks, were the populists. Not exactly. All right, so, right. This is important, and I gave a class on this called The Actual Nature of Revolution. So in Russia, let's talk about the history of Bolshevism here. Why not, right? Why not? We're having a great time here. Why not? So, in Russia, you had the Tsarist autocracy all throughout Europe in the 1840s, and later you had all these uprisings demanding a democratic republic. Russia maintained the Tsarist autocracy, right? The Tsar is like the Pope and the king combined, right? He's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, ordained by God to rule. He's also the king. He's like the king and the Pope. So, in Russia, there were people that were fighting against the Tsarist autocracy. The first major movement against the Tsarist autocracy was called the Narodniks. And Narodnik means people. Narodnia is the people, right? The Narodniks were the peopleists, so their name literally means populists. The Narodniks, however, their belief was that it would be the peasantry of Russia that would make the revolution. The Narodniks. And it was the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the Friends of the People, they were called, the Narodniks. They believed it would be the peasantry that would make the revolution. And people joke about them because they used to dress up in costumes. They were all very, very wealthy. Most of them were from noble or wealthy capitalist backgrounds, but they would dress up as if they were peasants, go into the countryside and try to get the peasants to rise up. And the peasants didn't listen to them and didn't quite care for them and didn't buy it. And it was a revolutionary movement. Peter Kropotkin, who was kind of considered one of the most influential thinkers on anarchism, he was a Narodnik, and his movement was he built communes. He bought land among the peasants, where the peasants would farm land communally. There wouldn't be nobles and serfs and people owning the land. You know, that was the Narodnik movement. It didn't work. Didn't work. Trotsky was a Narodnik for a while. It was a big movement. It didn't work. So the next movement in Russia, among the failure of Narodnikism, you had terrorism. And that was not an insult. That was not an insult. That was actually what they called themselves, the terrorist movement, they were called. And they went around assassinating government officials, blowing things up, in the hopes that that would inspire a mass uprising. They were terrorists, and they shot Tsar Alexander III, and Lenin's brother, Lenin's older brother, was a terrorist and was hanged for trying to kill the Tsar. And it was the terrorist movement, right? So you had the terrorists, and their idea was if they were going to commit an act of explosive violence, and that was going to inspire an uprising. They were left adventurists. It was kind of like the anarchist stuff that comes out of Spain, propaganda of the deed. Of course, that didn't work, and in fact, it reinforced the patriarchal and feudal structures. Why? Because people are scared. Oh my God, there's people blowing stuff up. This is terrifying. I'm going to follow the government. It doesn't work. It doesn't work, right? Propaganda of the deed, terrorism, forget it, right? All that did was make the people doing it feel really good about themselves. It didn't work. Marxism came to Russia after the failure of terrorism, after the failure of Narodnikism. And it came to Russia largely because of Yuri Plekhanov. And Plekhanov was an individual who understood Marxism, and he argued that the factory workers in Russia would be the ones that would make the revolution. And he established, at first it was the Emancipation of Labor Group, and then eventually, along with Lenin, along with others, he created the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP. And it was part of the Second International. It was a Marxist party. So Yuri Plekhanov brought Marxism to Russia, and what made the Marxists different than the Friends of the People, the Narodniks, which is translated as populist, doesn't have the same meaning, but the Narodniks from the terrorists, is they believed in building labor unions. That's basically what the Marxists in Russia believed in. They believed in building labor unions. And then among the Marxists, you had Lenin, who said that, well, the Marxists should form a party of a new type. It was a new kind of revolutionary conspiratorial organization that Lenin developed that engages in propaganda and agitation. It's the vanguard of the people. That was Lenin's theory of how to build a revolutionary organization. That was the Bolsheviks, whereas most of your members of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party just kind of wanted to have a loose association and build trade unions and encourage people to go on strike. That was the difference. That's the history. That's the trajectory of Russian revolutionary politics. What's interesting is that Mao Zedong in China, before he joined the Communist Party of China when it was founded in 1921, Mao was a Narodnik. He was inspired by Peter Kropotkin and his anarchism. And Mao's group, they had this thing called the All People's Study Society, the All People's Study, or the New People's Study Society, it's called, or the New People's Study Group. And that group, they were Kropotkinists, and Mao was a Kropotkinist because Mao was from the countryside, and China's population was overwhelmingly peasantry, and so Mao was a Kropotkinist. But then the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, and Mao said, okay, maybe these Bolsheviks have something. He eventually joined the Communist Party. I think that's fascinating that Mao was originally a Kropotkinist anarchist. And that many people argue that Mao's military practice during the 1930s, where he waged a rural people's war, went out to the countryside, seized liberated territories where they divided up the land, that was very much similar to what Kropotkin had done. Mao was not in urban areas in Russia building factory unions. Mao went to the countryside and organized the peasantry. So, in a way, Mao's military strategy, Mao's, political practice in China was very much Kropotkinist influenced and influenced by Kropotkinist anarchism. I think that's very fascinating. But what else is on people's minds? What else is new, folks? Yes. Now, people are asking me what I think of William Z. Foster's critique of Huey Long. I've read what William Z. Foster wrote about Huey Long, and again, that's based on the fact that the Communist Party was aligned with Roosevelt, and that the Huey Long movement was not. That's what that's about. Now, Arthur Porter has asked me about revisionism. So let's talk about revisionism, right? That's become just a nasty word in the Marxist movement. If I don't agree with you, I maintain that I'm a real Marxist and you're a revisionist. You're revising Marxism, but I believe in real Marxism. You're a revisionist. And that's what it's come to be known as, right? If I think you're a sellout and a phony, I call you a revisionist. And if you think I'm a sellout and a phony, you call me a revisionist. That's not what the term actually originated as. The term revisionist was invented by Edward Bernstein. And Edward Bernstein called himself a revisionist. He thought it was a good thing to be a revisionist. Edward Bernstein was a political figure in the Second International. After Marx had died, you had, the continuing Marxist movement in Europe centered around the German Social Democratic Party. You had the Second International. This fellow by the name of Edward Bernstein, who actually had some direct connections to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, like I think he was related or something. He was not a small figure. This wasn't some obscure figure. This was somebody who really was prominent among the Marxist movement. Edward Bernstein. He came out with his new theory of Marxism that he called revisionist Marxism, or revisionism. And basically, his theory centered around the slogan, "The movement is everything, the goal is nothing." The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And basically, he disagreed with Marx about the need for a revolution. He argued that no, capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism, one step at a time. He argued that there was no event horizon. There was no revolution that took place. This notion that one day you have a revolution and you go from capitalism to socialism, he didn't agree with that. His notion was that socialism is merely the sum of reforms. And he argued that the fact that, and this is hilarious, I think, that universal male suffrage existed. No one was even talking about letting women vote. But the fact that in Germany, Austria, France, other countries, they let every man vote, whether he owned property or not, proved that you didn't have to have a revolution, because eventually the working class would outvote the capitalist class because there was more of them. Universal male suffrage was the first step towards socialism in Europe, he argued, right? Next, they had some places, like in Britain and other places, where they passed a 12-hour workday. They couldn't make you work more than 12 hours, right? Wow. You know, and that was Edward Bernstein. Edward Bernstein he said there was no contradiction between reform and revolution, that reform and revolution are synonymous, and that the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, and that socialism is merely what he said, the quote, sum of reforms. That's Edward Bernstein. And he said he was a revisionist. And it was based on the fact that revolutions were not happening in Europe. The Marxist movement was huge. 1880s, 1890s. Marxism was expanding all over Europe, but there wasn't a revolution. So why was that? Well, Edward Bernstein said, well, it's because the revolution is merely the sum of reforms. And we're not going to have a revolution. We're just going to kind of gradually move towards socialism. Look, we got universal male suffrage. Next, we're going to have, 12-hour work days. Next thing you know, we're going to have labor unions recognized in factories. Pretty soon, we're going to have socialism. So that's Bernstein. And that's basically social democracy. The forces that call themselves social democrats, they want to build socialism one step at a time, and they don't think there's a clear dividing line. A lot of the forces in DSA, are Edward Bernstein oriented. I know I interviewed and did reporting on Cecily McMillan, who was an Occupy Wall Street activist, who was charged and eventually went to prison here in New York. She went to prison for assault on a police officer. A very widely publicized case. I went to a lot of events, and I interviewed her a few times. And one thing that she said to me is she would quote Edward Bernstein. She believed the movement was everything, the goal was nothing. She believed in reform, not revolution, but reform was revolution, she would say. And that's how a lot of the founding people of DSA think. Now, not all, and that's a complicated issue, and DSA is a very big tent. But the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, socialism is the sum of reforms. That was the revisionist current. And Karl Kautsky was the main opponent of revisionism. Karl Kautsky was the leader of German social democracy, and he maintained, no, revolution has to happen. This is not correct. And that was interesting. The Marxist movement, the Second International, technically opposed revisionism on paper. And Karl Kautsky was famous for his arguments against Bernstein. The Kautsky German Social Democrats didn't agree with Bernstein. Bernstein folks broke away and formed the revisionist movement, and they were not part of the Second International. They were not the mainstream current of Marxism. Karl Kautsky and Edward Bernstein didn't like each other. Fascinating history there. However, I will add that there was another component to Edward Bernstein and revisionism that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is that Edward Bernstein was what you could call a social imperialist, whereas he believed not only was capitalism in the West gradually transforming into socialism one step at a time, but that colonialism was good because it was bringing capitalism that was more advanced than what existed in the third world to the third world, so that colonialism was good. That's a big part of Bernsteinism that people don't recognize, right? Social imperialism, right? That, hey, the British are going to go take over India. That's great because they're going to make India capitalist, and then eventually India will become socialist. That's great, right? The British are going to Africa and slaughtering whole villages. Well, we don't believe in slaughtering whole villages, but again, they're going to make Africa capitalist. Eventually Africa will become socialist, social imperialism. And that was a big part of the revisionist current as well. Social imperialism, right? So that's the essence of revisionism, right? Now, the term, Lenin was obviously very opposed to Edward Bernstein. Lenin eventually was very opposed to Karl Kautsky. But the talk of revisionism didn't really get revived, I guess, until the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and China had their falling out in 1961, the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet split of 1961 was when the term revisionism got more broadly used among Marxists and leftists. And that was because Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union, and he was trying to have peace with the West. And he basically told people all throughout the developing world that they should not have revolutions because it was too dangerous, because the United States had the atomic bomb. USA has the atomic bomb, so people in South Africa, people in Latin America, people in Asia don't have a revolution. It's too scary. The USA has the atomic bomb. Put the world revolution on hold. USA has the atomic bomb. Stop it. That was his argument. So China, under the leadership of Mao, eventually cut ties with the Soviet Union. And they accused the Soviet Union of being revisionist. And that was what they pulled that out of the history of Marxism. They said the Soviet leaders are revisionists, right? And there's a manifesto, Long Live Leninism, was one of the documents the Chinese Communist Party published to criticize Khrushchev. There's another document, on Khrushchev's phony communism and its lessons for the world. There's a number of manifestos the Chinese Communist Party published to criticize Khrushchev and the Soviet leaders. They called them revisionists. However, and this is where it gets interesting, from 1961, from the first days of the Sino-Soviet split, up until about 1969, China never said the Soviet Union was capitalist. It said that it was revisionist. Like, that was the difference, right? 1961, China and the Soviet Union cut ties. 1966, you have the Cultural Revolution in China, which is basically Mao accusing the Chinese Communist Party of being revisionist and building a mass movement of young people to overthrow the leaders of the Communist Party. And that happened in 1966. Students all across China, the Red Guards, overthrew the Communist Party leadership. Then in 1969, the end of the 1960s, they called a new Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And it was an entirely new party. They'd thrown out all the people that were opposed to Mao and the Cultural Revolution. It was a totally new party. And at the 1969 Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, interestingly, Mao at that point was so old, right? Mao is the leader of the revolution. He just kind of walks out. Very famous video clip. You've probably seen it. If you watch any documentary about Chinese history, Mao, who's very old man, very large, he just kind of walks out and waves at everybody, and everyone in the audience is sobbing and crying because Mao is the leader of the Chinese Revolution, and they're all waving their red books, and they're just sobbing and crying, and it's this huge auditorium of people, and Mao walks out and waves at everybody, and everyone's waving their red books and crying, and it's this hugely emotional moment. And that's what Mao did at the Chinese Communist Party's 1969 Congress. Mao didn't really do that much because he was really, really old. But the guy who gave the big speech, the main report to the Chinese Communist Party's 1969 Congress, the guy who did that was Lin Biao, who was a general who had fought alongside Mao, who was the man who was behind the Cultural Revolution mainly. And Lin Biao, he gave a speech at the 1969 Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, and that speech was published as a book that China sent all over the world. And that book is called Long Live the Victory of People's War. Long Live the Victory of People's War. And that book also doesn't say the Soviet Union was capitalist. It says the Soviet Union was revisionist, right? It talks about Mao's military theory of how you organize in the countryside and seize the cities, guerrilla warfare, Che Guevara kind of stuff. And then it goes from there to argue that the global communist revolution will be based on Mao's military strategy for the Chinese revolution. That the third world is like the countryside of the world, and eventually the third world will have communist revolution, and then the third world will seize the first world. That's basically what it argues. That there's no point in really having a revolution in the United States or in Western Europe because they're too capitalist, but the third world will have its revolution first, and then eventually the first world will be seized, right? It's third worldism, basically, right? But, in the third world, being a third worldist isn't a thing. But it was, Lin Biao's Long Live the Victory of People's War. And then the last chapter of Long Live the Victory of People's War by Lin Biao, the final part of his presentation to the 1969 Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, the final part of his presentation is called "The Soviet Revisionists Are Betrayers of People's War." You read it, he says the Soviet Union are traitors to the people around the world that are fighting for, revolution and all that. The Soviet Union sold them out. It's not supporting them. It's not good. Doesn't say they're an empire, doesn't say they're capitalist. It wasn't until the fall of Lin Biao mysteriously disappears. They said he died in he was trying to overthrow Mao, and then he got on a plane and tried to go to the Soviet Union or something. He died with the Gang of Four that came into power after the fall of Lin Biao, Mao's wife and 3 other people, the Gang of Four. They declared the Soviet Union, they stopped calling the Soviet Union revisionist, and they started calling the Soviet Union social imperialists, state capitalists, social imperialists, social fascists. That is the difference. Revisionist is a term for a Marxist who is no longer believing in revolution. Social imperialist means you're not a Marxist at all. You're an imperialist. Big difference, right? Keep in mind, Fidel Castro also said the Soviet leaders were revisionists. Keep in mind, Che Guevara also said the Soviet leaders were revisionists. Kim Il-sung also said the Soviet leaders were revisionists. There was widespread belief that the Soviet leaders were revisionists. But there was not, when China declared the Soviet Union was an imperialist country, it was a capitalist country, that was a completely different change. That was not the same thing at all. And that's important, right? And I think that needs to be raised. So I hope that answers your question. When someone says revisionist, it's just become a slur. It means I don't agree with you. But what it actually meant, originally it was this current among social democrats, and then it became a slur during the Cold War, and that's what the term revisionism means. And it's very interesting, because again, everyone you don't like is a revisionist, right? And there you go. And to some degree, this notion that Marxism is like the Bible, right? You only believe the true holy word of Marx, right? Well, Lenin disagreed with Karl Marx on many points. Lenin supported nationalism. Marx said that all nationalism was reactionary. Marx believed that the revolutions would happen first in the Western countries and then expand to the third world. Lenin said, flip, it's going to happen in the third world first, it'll go to the first world, right? Marx did not understand, capitalism in Marx's time evolved to the system of imperialism or capitalism in its monopoly stage, the rule of finance capital. In Marx's times, industrial capitalists ruled. In the time of Lenin, it was bankers that ruled. So Lenin was a revisionist, I guess, right? He revised Marxism. That's not the whole thing, right? That Marxism is a science, right? That you don't, Marxism is not religion. It's not like, well, in the holy writing of Marx it says, so therefore, there used to be a bumper sticker. There used to be a bumper sticker that said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. I remember that from my little town in Ohio. There was a bumper sticker. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. Well, that's not how you're supposed to think if you're a Marxist. All right? If you want to be an evangelical Christian, that's a great bumper sticker for you to have. But if you say, Marx said it, I believe it, and that settles it, that means you support the British colonizing India. That means that you support the USA taking over Texas from Mexico. That means you don't believe in, you believe all nationalism is inherent. No, come on now. Come on. Dogmatism, says JT24, and he's right. That's what that is, right? If your attitude is Marx said it, I believe it, that settles it, Just like an evangelical, let me back that up. Right? Evangelical Christians, as Bill Maher and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins are key to point out, they don't really believe that, right? Because the Bible also says don't eat shellfish. The Bible also says that disrespectful children should be stoned to death. So no Christian who says, God says it, I believe it, and that settles it, I follow the Bible. No, they don't, right? And no Marxist who goes around saying, I am a pure Marxist, I do not revise Marxism at all, they don't. They don't. Right? They don't. So, dogma is not a good thing. In religion, in politics, in ideology, dogma is not a good thing. The class I'm giving, that I mentioned at the beginning in New York City, is called, What is Scientific Socialism? And scientific socialism, science means thinking scientifically. KJ Mack says that her dog is a revisionist, or his dog, I should say, is a revisionist. Well, I don't know if you're male or female, KJ Mack. I apologize. Shouldn't have assumed, but I guess your dog's a revisionist. There you go. There's a movie that came out called La Chinoise. It was by a French filmmaker, Jean-Luc Godard. It's about a group of French students who are Maoists, and they are having fights among each other. And that when they don't like somebody, they go revisionniste, revisionniste, and they're all waving their red books and chanting, "You're a revisionist, revisionniste, revisionniste." It's, oh boy, what an afternoon, folks! What an afternoon! Wow, we're having a great time here, folks. Aren't we having a great time? What else is new? What else is going on, folks? I got plenty to talk about. I really do. One thing that I've noticed, and I'm going to open another can of the beverage that will not be named. So, enjoy it. Just pouring the beverage that will not be named, that I did name earlier, as Arthur Porter points out, but that's okay, right? As I pour the beverage, I've noticed that with the Hong Kong protests that are happening, that there's been a big problem on the U.S. left, which is that I'm not surprised to see a bunch of leftists supporting the Hong Kong protesters. Why? Because they hate China, because they're protesting, because they're singing songs from Les Miserables, so therefore they must be revolutionary. Right? I've seen this movie before. But what disturbs me is that I've noticed that if you say George Soros on the left, there's a lot of people who go, that's anti-Semitic, that's Fox News crap, there's no such thing as George Soros, it's something Republicans made up, it's racist, anti-Obama, Republican stuff, don't say that. Well, no, George Soros is a real person. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a real person. And if you don't believe me, watch Morning Joe on MSNBC. Why? His daughter, Mika Brzezinski, is on there. And if there is a Mika Brzezinski, there has to be a Zbigniew Brzezinski. So please. George Soros is a real person. And he's an anti-communist. He's a liberal. And I've noticed that among leftists, there is, because the right wing picked up on the whole George Soros thing, there is now this belief among leftists, not leftists, but among liberal types, social democrats, that there's no such thing as a color revolution. That there's no such thing as George Soros. It's all just some big, Fox News conspiracy theory that they just made up. Well, it is real. And in my new book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, I talk about color revolutions. So, I figured I would read to you a section from my new book about what a color revolution is. Enjoy. Just finding the right page. This is a section from my new book called The Rise of the Color Revolutions. Zbigniew Brzezinski's entire career involved fomenting discontent in socialist countries, and he learned how to manipulate the intelligentsia of frustrated intellectuals across the socialist world. Brzezinski combined his efforts with those of Hungarian billionaire George Soros. Soros funneled money to dissident groups, helping to create instability in socialist countries. The grievances which Brzezinski and Soros manipulated were very real. The socialist countries faced an economic blockade, preventing the inflow of consumer goods and Western technology. In the face of constant military threats and covert efforts to overturn socialism, the Marxist-Leninist governments maintained a very authoritarian political system, not offering the freedom that many young people longed for. While the industrial workers of the socialist countries were largely content, it was the educated strata of the youth, often the children of privileged party bureaucrats, who felt stifled. I'm glad you're reading along, Kinky. In each of the various countries that saw capitalism restored during the late 1980s and early 1990s, a group of confused young intellectuals played a central role. The young nonconformists among the intellectual strata of socialist countries were in awe of blue jeans, rock music, and Western consumer goods. Most of these young people did not believe they were marching to overthrow socialism, but rather they were simply marching for freedom. They believed that in following their revolution against the Marxist-Leninist government, they could keep guaranteed employment, health care, and housing, but simply add to it a higher level of civil liberties, artistic freedom, and the inflow of Western consumer goods. These illusions defined the Prague Spring of 1968 and were perpetuated up until the 1990s. The illusion was that the synthetic left represented a more humane and less authoritarian form of socialism. In reality, it simply opened the door to free market plunder and recolonization of Eastern Europe by Western capitalism. The formula was replicated across the communist bloc. Young intellectuals mobilized to protest around vague demands for freedom. Sections of the police force and the military would express sympathy with them. Western media would play up the idea that the tyrannical regime was on the verge of massacring the peaceful demonstrators, and amid the chaos and panic, a pro-US faction of the military would seize power. The new regime, with the blessing of Washington, would then proceed to dismantle the economic system, sell off state assets, and reduce the population to extreme poverty. The vote to preserve the Soviet Union was overwhelming. The peoples of the smaller republics, which U.S. media often described as colonies that were longing for independence, voted to preserve the USSR at an even higher rate than the Russians did. This popular vote was ignored by the pro-Western faction that seized power, and the Soviet Union was dissolved. In Russia, the first election following the fall of the Soviet Union resulted in mass victories for the Communist Party. Boris Yeltsin then used his emergency powers to dissolve the legislature. When the communist deputies refused to leave their posts, Yeltsin sent the military to crush them. What followed was a bloody episode of street fighting in which 187 people were killed and 437 others were wounded. This model of staging color revolutions to overthrow socialist and anti-imperialist governments continues up to this day. The Arab Spring of 2011 was cheered on by social media and American TV networks in language that sounded almost Trotsky-esque. Anne-Marie Slaughter, Samantha Power, and various figures within Hillary Clinton's State Department spoke of a global strategy of toppling independent governments and socialist states as if it were a leftist cause. The Silicon Valley elites and social media monopolists joined the operation. An essay by Anne-Marie Slaughter for Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, proclaims, quote, "The people must come first, and when they do not, sooner or later they will overthrow their governments." Slaughter's text goes on to talk about the evils of populism and why social media led revolutions and the responsibility to protect, that's R2P clause in the UN Charter, must be used to topple regimes that don't respect the free market and the open international system and freedom of information. One is reminded of Trotsky's theory of an endless, borderless, permanent revolution, except that Slaughter makes no pretense of being a socialist. It is a permanent revolution to restore the rule of Western monopolist bankers. It is the mindset of the revolutionary intelligentsia in the service of the Atlanticist pathology. The claim that unregulated capitalism would bring prosperity was widely discredited in Eastern Europe, as the swift implementation of free markets resulted in a humanitarian crisis. In each nation, mass unemployment, mass starvation, and mass poverty accompanied Western corporations looting the country. Sex trafficking and heroin became a big part of the new order of capitalism in Eastern Europe. The rate of suicide and drug-related deaths skyrocketed. In Russia, the rate of heroin addiction increased by roughly 900% in the decade following the fall of the Soviet Union. Naomi Klein's widely praised book, The Shock Doctrine, described the results of free market policies in Russia. Quote, "More than 80% of Russian farms had gone bankrupt, and roughly 70,000 state factories had closed their doors, creating an epidemic of unemployment." She goes on to describe how 74 million Russians lived in poverty, and, quote, 25% of Russians, almost 37 million people, lived in poverty described as desperate. With its farms and factories closed down, amid the dismantling of socialism, Russia became a captive market for the imperialists. It was forced to import its food from the United States and steel and raw materials from Western countries. Wealthy Western capitalists saw control of the Russian market as a way to reap super profits. Among those who plundered Russia was Bill Browder of Hermitage Capital Management, now featured as an expert on Vladimir Putin on Western television. He has also testified before the U.S. Congress. Klein quoted Russian academic Viktor Gusev, who said, quote, "The years of criminal capitalism have killed off 10% of our population." Indeed, the population of Russia decreased by 6.6 million between 1992 and 2006. U.S. economist Andre Gunder Frank used the term economic genocide and was echoed by Russian Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, who said children and elderly people had been hit the hardest. Former U.S. Senator Bill Bradley described what he observed in Russia when working with the Clinton administration during the 1990s. Quote, 30% unemployment, rampant inflation, pensions gone, savings gone, 30 or 40 years, it's all gone. No jobs. A few people doing very well who bought the state assets, but average person, no. The rise of Russian President Vladimir Putin now declared to be an enemy by the voices representing Western capitalism, marked a turning point as the Russian state apparatus stepped in to stop the chaos of the market. Putin's academic dissertation spoke of utilizing national champions, state-controlled megacorporations, to reboot the economy. Putin gradually put his college thesis into practice. Gazprom and Rosneft were put at the center of an economy that was then reorganized around the state. Gradually moving back toward elements of central planning, the Putin government has raised living standards, restoring order from the disaster created by free markets under Yeltsin. During the first 8 years of Putin's presidency, poverty was reduced by 14% and wages doubled. Russia experienced industrial expansion of more than 70%. Between 2007 and 2014, Russia's gross domestic product increased from $764 billion to $2,096.8 billion. Russia is no longer a captive market for the West. Russia's ability to grow its own food was almost wiped out during the 1990s, but in recent years, the Putin government has constructed a modern state-controlled agricultural system. Russia now exports more grain than any other country in the world, bringing in roughly $20 billion a year in revenue. Russia's agricultural exports jumped by 20% in 2018, and the state plans for the country to be an agricultural superpower by 2024, with a goal set for over $45 billion in revenue. Looking over the results of Putin's economic policy, Dr. Marshall Goldman of Harvard University wrote, quote, "It is understandable why the Russian people regard Vladimir Putin as their savior. John Brown, the CEO of BP, that's British Petroleum, has praised Putin's policies, saying, quote, 'No country has come so far in so short of a time.' Putin is not a Marxist or a leftist, and the Russian government does not espouse such politics. Putin's construction of a state-centered economy has been carried out in the name of Russian nationalism and the Orthodox Church, not social revolution and dialectical materialism. He doesn't offer permanent revolution, but rather the hope that Russia can be allowed to experience economic growth and maintain its unique identity as a long-existing Eurasian civilization without Western interference. In the 21st century, the revolutionary intelligentsia's vague psychological desire for chaos in order to achieve freedom, no matter what the human cost, has become a vehicle to tear down borders and spread capitalism across the planet. With slick romantic staging, the U.S. State Department's efforts to topple populists and dictators who get in the way of Wall Street are presented almost like contrived scenes from the Broadway musical Les Miserables. As a result of Western capitalism hijacking the revolutionary aesthetics, actually existing socialism has become more conservative in its messaging. Profits and instability are associated with Western social liberalism, while governments presiding over state-run economies often align themselves with traditional values. And that is the section in my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, where I talk about color revolutions. And they play a role in a bigger thesis, the central thesis of my book about city builders and vandals and the confusion of left and right. So you can get it, lulu.com, amazon.com, any place that books are sold, barnesandnoble.com. You can get it online. Order the book today. I think you'll like it. I'm doing a book event about it in Rhode Island. Pretty soon. Kinky loves it. Jacob Maxey loves it. I think you all should get a book. Get a copy. That was the section on color revolutions. And that, by the way, color revolutions is exactly what's happening in Hong Kong. Did a great interview with a friend of mine named Daniel Burke about it. You can see that. That's on the YouTube channel. I posted it yesterday. Added some graphics of what he was talking about. Good stuff, folks. But yeah, I had a good time there. What else is new? What else is new, folks? What else is happening? What else can we talk about? Folks, I'm just going to go over this. Oh, now, Neon Noir wants to know my thoughts on Michael Parenti. I love Michael Parenti. I have learned so much from Michael Parenti's work. I've even posted one of his old talks from the 1980s, where he talks a lot about socialism in the Soviet Union on my channel. I'm a huge Michael Parenti fan. I recommend Michael Parenti's work, absolutely. In terms of economics, we don't exactly line up perfectly, but overall, you know, the writing he does is amazing. His book, The Culture Struggle, is very amazing stuff. Black Shirts and Reds is an amazing book. Anything Parenti is good. And in this book, City Builders and Vandals, I actually quote extensively from Parenti in the section about Julius Caesar. That book he wrote about Julius Caesar is an amazing piece of not just history, but historiography. I'm a huge Parenti fan. So I hope that answers your question, Neon Noir. I wanted to just draw attention to something that annoys me. Okay. Why Bernie Sanders is wrong about Sweden. Okay. You know, the grass is always greener, as they say. You're never happy with what you have. So, I don't want to be that way. I was brought up to be thankful for what I have, to try and not be one of those people who's never satisfied, who's constantly griping and complaining. But like, okay, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, no one was talking about socialism in the United States. No one. For someone to get up and say they were a socialist was like, did he just, you know, they called Obama a socialist in 2008 as a way to slur him. It was like, he's a socialist. You know, did they say that? You know, it was like no one ever, right? So obviously, the way things are now is so much better than the way things have been. I'm trying not to complain about it too much. But, folks, okay, Sweden's not a socialist country. It's a capitalist country with a very big welfare state. That's what it is. Bernie Sanders, Democratic Socialists of America, their way of responding to communism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried is say, well, what about Sweden? As to try and present Swedish welfare capitalism as socialism. It's not. However, at least they're consistent. The Bernie Sanders people, they don't want the banks, factories, and industries to be run by the people. They want to give people free health care. They want to give people free education. They want a big welfare state. They're consistent. They are consistent. I'll give them that. They're consistent. Bernie Sanders, free college, free health care, tax the rich, Green New Deal. They're consistent, okay? The right wing is not consistent for a darn second. What is socialism according to Charlie Kirk? What is capitalism according to Charlie Kirk? What is socialism according to Ben Shapiro? What is capitalism? These people can't make up their minds, all right? 1 minute, the United States is socialist. It's a full-blown socialist country. The United States is full-blown socialism. That's why we have problems, right? If we were capitalists, no one would ever be poor, right? Because real capitalism, right? The USA is socialist because of income tax. The USA is socialist because of what? Because of Social Security, because we have a post office. Sometimes the USA is socialist. However, when the USA is doing very well, it's because we're capitalist, right? That's what made America great. So sometimes when the USA is doing well, it's capitalist. When the USA is bad, it's because of socialism. This article, right? Norway is a capitalist country. Norway is a capitalist country. Sweden is a capitalist country. But you read this article, right? It's in a newspaper that regularly argues that, like, giving people free college is communism. And it starts making the argument that Norway is not like what Bernie Sanders advocates, right? Norway is not democratic socialism because, quote, this is classic. Lots of Americans think it's Medicare for all, but it's not a national system. It's a regional system. We've had a problem with productivity in the healthcare sector. So now we have more freedom of choice and competition. Okay, in Sweden, the government gives everyone free healthcare. Right? And it works. But no. It's not Medicare for all because it's done on a regional level. And in some areas, people have more... it's... Sweden can't be Bernie Sanders' welfare state vision because it works, and everyone knows it doesn't work. So Sweden must be capitalist, but the USA is socialist. And then, of course, whenever China comes up, whenever you point to China's huge economics, it's because it's capitalist. China's capitalist. But now, when China, is getting a lot of bad press around Hong Kong, look at the evil communists in China. That's what they want to bring to the USA. The right wing doesn't have a consistent... They're not consistent. Right? The DSA, the Social Democrats have redefined socialism to mean welfare state. Okay. They're consistent. I don't agree with them, but they're consistent. The right wing, socialism is whatever is bad in the current news cycle. Capitalism is whatever is good in the current news cycle. And therefore, they get to use that against every socialist. It's ridiculous, right? When Rand Paul says we can't vote for Bernie Sanders because look what Pol Pot did. Do you think for a moment that Bernie Sanders' politics are the politics of Pol Pot? But no, that's socialism. It's the right way, and no one calls them on this. No one calls them on this. It's pretty ridiculous. It drives me up the wall. So now, right, Bernie Sanders is a democratic socialist, but Sweden is right-wing free market capitalism because their free healthcare given to people by the government is on a regional level. So that doesn't count, right? It's like the amount of no true Scotsman that these people play they have an ideological worldview. Capitalism and free markets always work and never fail. And if there's a situation where the free market is failing, well, that must not be real capitalism. If there's a situation where socialism is working, well, somehow I'm going to invent a loophole so that... These people are brainwashed. They are. I hate to sound like a jerk here, right? And but it's like when people can look at the United States and think that the reason we have all our problems is because we're socialist. Can look at Sweden and insist it's capitalist because it's by the same standard. Can look at China, where the government controls the major centers of economic power and they have a ruling communist party, and insist that it must be capitalist. And then, when China does what they think are bad things in Hong Kong, suddenly it's communist again. Oh, suddenly it's socialist again. These people aren't in touch with reality. Right? They don't care about the truth. Capitalism is good. Capitalism is good. It's like they've sat there and they're just like programmed psychologically. The free market is always the answer. 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 That's how these people think, right? Oh, China just did something good. They're capitalist. China just did something bad. They're communist. Sweden just did something good. They're capitalist. Sweden just did something bad. They're communist, right? The USA is having problems, mostly because we're communist now. The USA is doing good things. See, that's capitalism working. They have been psychologically programmed. You could show them the sun and the moon, and they wouldn't believe you. They would say, capitalism says the sky is green, so the sky must be green. It is. And you could say the sky is blue. Look at the sky. It's blue. You can see. Take your eyes. Look at the sky. It's blue. No. The free market says the sky must be green, so the sky is green. Capitalism is always the answer. China must be capitalist if it's bad, and it must be capitalist if it's good. China must be capitalist if it's good. Oh, China's doing bad things. It must be communist. This is how these people think. They have literally, not much going on in there, right? 1 minute, oh, look how great, Charlie Kirk's tweeting out, look how great China is. Why? Because it's capitalist. Oh, Hong Kong. Oh, look how bad China is because it's communist, right? Oh, Sweden's having problems. Look how bad socialism is. It's wrecking their economy, refugees. Oh, Sweden's doing good. Oh, it must be because they're capitalist. I get frustrated a little bit with the Bernie Sanders definition of things. I think a welfare state would be good. I think we should have social programs for people. I'm frustrated that they equate socialism with the sum of reforms. Frustrated with the Edward Bernstein stuff, but at least they're consistent. At least the definition doesn't change every 2 minutes based on what is convenient for the argument. And what I don't understand is, how do the fans of these people not just go along with it? I mean, it's like a movie, you know. The good guy is capitalism, the bad guy is socialism, and the bad guy sometimes looks one way and sometimes looks another way, but he's always the bad guy, and the good guy is always, I don't know. I mean, there's just not a lot of intellectual depth going on. I called this live, "We Are Such Stuff," and that's from the Shakespeare quote, "We are such stuff that dreams are made of." I thought it was poetic. I'm always trying to figure out new names for the lives. I don't want to call them the same thing over and over and over again. That's boring. That's boring. So we want to give things new names. So "We Are Such Stuff." That's what I went with today. There you go. But how are folks doing? What else? What suggestions do you have? What suggestions do you have? I'm having a great time here this afternoon. I'm drinking lots of Diet Coke. I'm sitting in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. I don't have to have the air conditioner on because it's not so hot today. So there you go. I'm having a great time here, folks. You know, Arthur asked me about revisionism, and I quoted that slogan, "The movement is everything, the goal is nothing." And I got to tell you, I would get very, very frustrated with a political organization that I was in for many years, because I felt like that should have been the slogan of this group. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. There was no interest in socialism, except they would tack at the end of every speech, "And we need to have a revolution and overthrow capitalism." So they would give a speech about, hey, you know, just typical, we're going to go build a liberal rally around whatever the latest democratic liberal cause is, and then they would tack on the end of it, "And we need to have socialism." And so they thought that they were doing their job. There was a lack of interest in any theory and ideology. And the movement is everything, the goal is nothing should have been, that was what they were about, right? And I was constantly being criticized because I actually believed in socialism. It was weird. It was very, very weird. There were a lot of personal attacks on me that were very bizarre. If a white person had said to me some of the things that were said to me by people of color in that group, they would be called a racist. I was told, for example, being interested in revolutionary ideology is a, quote, white thing. Well, I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2013, and I met people from India, and people from Africa, and people from Asia, and people from all over the world who knew Lenin and Marx and ideology and communism up and down, and they weren't white. To say that only white people are capable of understanding Marxism is a racist statement. It's a racist statement. However, that's what somebody who was, I understand, is a very prominent leader of that group I was in, that was what they said to me on numerous occasions. The fact that I knew Marxist theory meant that I was a racist white man, because only white people are interested in communism. That was a direct quote. Quote, "Only white people are interested in communism." I was told that many times by a person of color who was in this communist group I used to be in. I kid you not, right? Why? Because the way they see it, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, right? I mean, and that should have been the slogan of the group I was in. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. Oh, you believe in... And the other thing that's weird, right? These people were very politically correct. They were into the whole thing. But yet, when they were criticizing me, they would often... So not only was it a racist white man thing to be interested in ideology, but it was, and this is my favorite, it was autistic. I've never identified whatever. I'm a normal fellow, whatever. I might be bookish or something, but they used the phrase autistic, or the term autistic, as if it was an insult. And isn't that like a big violation of the politically correct rules, right? I mean, that's like, but apparently if you understand Marxism, if you are interested in Lenin, if you've read a Lenin book in your life, not only are you a racist white male, because only white people read this stuff, apparently, but you're autistic. And that's an insult. This is some awful stuff, but this is how left-wing circles are. There's a lot of people on the left who don't think very deeply and really, really hate those who do. And it's really kind of sad. All the stuff we've talked about on here, the fact that I'm capable of talking about this, wasn't considered a strength in that organization I was in. It was considered to be something wrong with me. The fact that I knew the ideology the group believed in, was considered to be some big crime, right? Because because deep down a lot of them are liberals. They're liberals and they put on liberal rallies around whatever the latest trendy liberal cause is. And that's tragic. It's deeply tragic. It's deeply, deeply tragic, I would say. It is a deeply, deeply tragic thing. Because there are a lot of young people in the United States who are mad at capitalism and want to know what's wrong with society. And if you create an atmosphere on the left where having conversations like this, talking about what's wrong with capitalism, why we need socialism, no, that's not acceptable. No, we just have liberal rallies here, build the movement. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. Is a recipe not only for being wrong, for revisionism, but for failure. Because people want to know what's wrong. I will never forget when I was in college, around the time Obama got elected, and all these people I knew who had never dared criticize the wars, never dared criticize the torture the U.S. government was committing, all of a sudden woke up and were mad at the government, and were mad about torture, and were mad about their civil liberties going away, but they woke up wrong. And they said, we need real capitalism. We need real capitalism. The libertarian stuff was everywhere. And I said to these old baby boomer leftists I was working with, I said, people are waking up, but they're waking up wrong. They're against the wars, they're against the government, but ideologically, they don't have ideology. And if your attitude is that ideology, socialism, capitalism, ideology is wrong, ideology is a racist white man thing, ideology is for squares, ideology is for autistic white males, that's your attitude, you're going to fail. You're going to fail. Right? People want to know. Bernie Trump voters are a real thing, folks. There are a lot of people who voted for Bernie Sanders. There's a lot of people who voted for Obama, voted for Bernie Sanders, and voted for Trump. Why? Because Bernie Sanders sounded like a radical. He sounded like against the system. He had actual solutions. And Trump did the same thing. People want answers. They don't want to feel good about themselves. Right? Liberal rallies don't have the answer. Liberal rallies are not going to save us from the crisis facing our country. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need socialism. We need a society where the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not profits. More than anything, that's what we need right now. We really do. That's what we need. And it is a big problem that the left, a lot of the left, just goes along with whatever the liberals are doing. It's also a big problem that the conversations that we're having here are so unique, right? And that's why you all are here. If I was on here saying, these bleeping corporations have too much bleeping power, you wouldn't watch this. Why? Because you can get that all over the internet. I can think about 15 YouTube channels that are just some guy cursing and swearing into his microphone and repeating, Rachel Maddow talking points. But we're doing something special here. We're the city-building tendency. We are the city-building tendency of human history. We are. That's what we do. What else is on your mind, folks? I'm having a great time. We'll probably end soon, but I'm not in a rush to get out of here. What's on your mind? We're having a great time today. What's happening? What's new? I'm having a great time here today. Caleb, I could hear you talk forever, says Orga Mecca. Well, thank you. I work on it. I enjoy talking. It's something I really enjoy doing. I know some people don't. People have different skills, but I enjoy chatting and talking. It's something I've enjoyed, and I do it for a living, and I do it on here, and it's great. We're having a great time here. But what else is new, folks? What else is on people's minds? Someone asked me if state police is a socialist concept. No, it is not. Police exist to defend the property of the ruling order, whether that ruling order is capitalism or socialism. There will be police under socialism, but they will be serving the state property and the means of production being in the hands of the public good. But yeah, Who is this Michael Brooks people are talking about? I don't know who that is. I should know who that is, but I don't. I'm sorry. Maybe someone can tell me who that is. I see constant back and forth in the comments here about Michael Brooks. Michael Brooks. Who is Michael Brooks? What is this? Did I fall asleep and miss something? I know who David Brooks is. He's the columnist for the New York Times, the token conservative of the New York Times. Kinky says he's Sam Cedar's co-host. Well, I do know who Sam Cedar is. Okay, very, very good. Well, hey, folks, I'm having a great time here. I wanted to mention something which is interesting. So I'm just going to throw this out there because, hey, what the heck. So I don't know if folks saw... There's two news stories that stood out to me. Based on my life experience, they stood out to me. Number one was the petrochemical workers who were basically forced to go to a Trump rally. Did folks see that? Trump was speaking, and these petrochemical workers who work for, I forget, it was like BP, I believe, or Chevron, they were forced to go to a Trump rally, right? And if they didn't go, it was considered like an excused absence. So it wasn't like they got fired, but they wouldn't get overtime pay unless they went to this Trump rally. And that borders on violating the U.S. law, right? Your employer is never supposed to tell you who to vote for. Your employer is not supposed to in any way, and so, but that raises bigger questions. Right? I mean, I remember during the Iraq War when I was in school, I was constantly having to go as a school student to a pro-military, pro-war kind of things. It was always done under the guise of being like patriotic, but it was always it was always stated that if you didn't agree with the war, you were a bad person. I remember in school we had to make, for a while every morning, we would make these little like candy packets to send to the troops. I know my school, we adopted I think it was a cruiser, one of those ships, and we had to send them like, candy, and we assembled these like candy packets to send to the troops. And I remember, Veterans Day, we always had a school ceremony, and many times the veteran who spoke would denounce anti-war protesters and talk about how bad anti-war protesters were, and we were a captive audience. We were school kids. We were required to be there. We couldn't not go to the Veterans Day ceremony. Every year we had a 9/11 commemoration at my school, and again, it was often, and some Americans don't understand that we need these wars. If you're against the, I mean, there was often very partisan political statements. I remember, every year at the beginning of the school year, they would have like, they had like an event with the parents where you had to go sit there and listen to the rules. You'd sit there with your parents and you'd hear about the rules of the school in the coming year, and often, the student orientation, that's what it was called, at the beginning of the school year, would often turn into kind of a political rally. The principal or vice principal would start talking about how the media has so much sex and drugs in it, but we're a Christian town. We don't believe in that. And it was a public school, but there was constantly this kind of right-wing, it was weird. You were constantly getting right-wing political messaging, being pushed on you. And again, I didn't feel good about it because my family, we were like the only Democrats that I knew. And it was weird. But then I've noticed, though, that in Democratic Party areas, to be fair, and I am fair here, I try to keep an even-headed about things, there's a lot of, and again, it's done in the same way. It's kind of, innuendo, but there's a lot of, in New York City, public school kids, they're putting on plays that often have a very liberal message. Their teachers are criticizing Trump. That happens, right? And that it's kind of, you can't really help it. If you're in an area where the majority are one way, right? And you're the other way, it's very weird. It shows how divided the country really is. I guess that's the one thing. But that's not the funny one. The other news item that I saw that was kind of funny was, so apparently this woman who has won a city council seat in St. Louis, Missouri, swore in on a copy of a Dr. Seuss book. Did you see that? She swore in. You had your choice to swear in. Usually a Bible is used. But she swore in on a copy of Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. And she was making a political statement, obviously, right? That having people swear their oath of office on a Bible is a violation. And so to make a point, she swore in on Dr. Seuss' book. It's gotten a lot of publicity. She's being widely hated, is disrespecting Christians, blah, blah, blah. And it's funny, you remember how there were all these rumors that were not at all substantiated, that Obama was going to swear in on a Quran because he's a Muslim. Do you remember that? And I thought that was kind of amusing at the time. I remember there was a woman I was in college with who told me that she was sure Obama was going to swear in on a Quran. And then afterwards, months later, I said, so did you see Obama swearing on a Quran? And she's like, yeah, I heard he did that. I said, no, he didn't. And she never got the message that she'd been wrong about it. And she's like, but my dad said he was going to swear on a Quran. And he watches like TV and stuff. Like he watches a lot of like Fox. He knows. And he was telling me he was definitely going to swear in on a Quran. I mean, it was just, silly stuff. I will say, now that we're on that, right? Kinky's asking, what will Bernie Sanders swear in on, right? He is Jewish. Right? So will he swear in on a copy of the Torah? Right? Now, I also understand that Bernie Sanders is married to an Irish Catholic woman, and he attends Irish Catholic church with her. So maybe he'll swear in on a Bible. I don't know. And there's rumors, supposedly, that Bernie Sanders is an atheist, right? Not confirmed. We don't know. He's religious. He lists his religion as Judaism. So if Bernie Sanders were to win, would he swear in on... And also, interestingly enough, the Torah is just like the first 3 books of the Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. So he could swear in on like a chunk of a Bible, maybe. That's the Torah. Who knows? And not all Jews accept the Talmud. That's another thing, right? That there are many Jews that don't accept the Talmud. The Talmud does not represent all of the religion of Judaism. The Torah is all of Judaism. The Talmud represents the majority of Jews believe in the Talmud, but not all of them, right? I remember when I went to the United Nations, I was covering the United Nations, and I met a group of people who were protesting against Benjamin Netanyahu, and when he appeared at the UN, and they called themselves the true Torah Jews, and that was one of their big points. The Talmud is not really Jewish, right? And that Orthodox Judaism is very divided. Some Orthodox Jews accept the Talmud, some don't. The Torah, though, from what I understand, all followers of Judaism accept the Torah. But they have different interpretations of what it means. But there you go. But while we're on that, we're talking about Obama. I just want to throw this out there, The fact that Barack Obama was the president of the United States, the way his life story was sold to us shows how much media is controlled. Look at Barack Obama's life story. Okay, the liberals wrote their propaganda, great man, cult of personality version of his life story. And the conservatives wrote a stupid interpretation of his life story. And the actual story of Obama's life is crazy. First of all, Obama's grandparents were bankers. No one talks about that. Obama's grandmother was actually the first female president of the Bank of Hawaii. The media portrayed them like they were just down-home folks from Kansas. No. They were bankers. They ran the Bank of Hawaii, right? That was a bank that was involved in depositing money all throughout the Pacific and was involved in a lot of like U.S.-backed regimes in the Pacific, right? So that's Obama's grandparents. Obama's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, married Lolo Soetoro, who was a high-ranking general or a high-ranking military leader in Indonesia. Again, they make it sound like Obama's family was poor in Indonesia. They were not. Obama's stepfather, Lolo Soetoro, was involved in genocide against ethnically Chinese people, right? 1965, the government of Indonesia was toppled by the military, and they killed at least between 500,000 and 1 million people. Started out as they were killing communists. They had a list of communists given to them by the CIA. After that, they just started slaughtering people in mass. Ethnic Chinese communities, small business owners, people who worked with the Bank of China, all of them were being killed. Genocide against ethnically Chinese people. Barack Obama moved to Indonesia in 1967 as a child, and he lived in the home of a man who committed genocide. For real, the government of Indonesia, the military of Indonesia, committed Genocide. Obama's father, being a prominent member of the military that was exterminating whole villages and neighborhoods, Obama was living in a household with a stepfather who committed genocide. Big deal, folks. Big deal, right? And then they want to make it out about, oh, he went to a radical Muslim. He went to a Muslim school in Indonesia, right? Okay, that's not the point, right? Okay, he went to a school that was Muslim in Indonesia, right? Indonesia is a Muslim country, right? If he went to a private school in Indonesia, it was probably going to have Islam somewhere in its charter. That's not the point. The point is, before he went to that school in the morning, after he went to that school at night, he was in a house with a man who committed mass murder of ethnically Chinese people. I think that's interesting. Now, what's also interesting is that apparently Lolo Saturo, Obama's stepfather, didn't get along very well with the young Barack. So much so that Ann Dunham, the mother, sent little Barack back to live with his grandparents. People suspect that Lolo Saturo, the military Indonesian guy that his mother was married to, was physically abusing the young Barack Obama. Another interesting thing people don't talk about is apparently the young Barack Obama had a nanny who lived with them in Indonesia, who was named Turdi, I believe, who was a transgendered person. A person who was identified as female but was, had the biological characteristics of a male. And apparently that was the nanny of Barack Obama, was a transgendered person. I think that's fascinating. That's an interesting story. What's going on there? The other thing, Barack Obama has a half-sister, or an adopted sister, I should say. When Obama's mother and this military general were married, they adopted a young woman named Leah, L-I-A, Leah. So Obama had a sister, and the sister was invited to attend Barack Obama's inauguration and was too poor to even make it. Obama's upbringing is very strange. Between Hawaii, where his parents were bankers who were sending money to U.S.-aligned regimes and facilitating financial transactions all over the Pacific, to his mother, who was married to a guy who's high up in the Indonesian military, committing genocide against ethnically Chinese people, to his, transgender, cross-dressing nanny. Barack Obama had an interesting childhood. And liberals wrote this, Hollywood version of it, and then the only alternative was, he's a Muslim communist. He went to a Muslim school. Who cares? The interesting thing about the Muslim school, now the right wing maintain that, and it is proven, that on his form for attending the school, it lists his citizenship as Indonesian. So people say, well, that means he's not a U.S. citizen. It probably means that they didn't check, or they made an exception, or maybe he gave up his citizenship, but not real. That's where people, the birth certificate, the birther thing, okay, whatever, right? They're missing the point, though. Obama went, to a school in Indonesia, an elite private school that happened to be Muslim. No, that doesn't mean he's a member of Al-Qaeda. No, that doesn't mean he's secretly working for Iran and Saudi Arabia. No, you're missing the point. He lived in Indonesia, and his mother was married to a general who committed genocide against ethnically Chinese people. The Barack Obama childhood is off the wall. The Barack Obama childhood is off the wall. It's a story. And there's a lot of interesting things there. And we got the Hollywood version from the liberals. And now at this school he went to in Indonesia that was all over Fox News that proved he was a terrorist or something. Come on. There's a statue of the young Barack Obama in front of the school. I kid you not. And he's got a butterfly. I mean, it's weird. The Barack Obama childhood is fascinating. But it's not fascinating because he went to a radical Muslim school because he's a terrorist. No, it's not. That's not the story. And it's not what you saw, in the New York Times and in the Democratic Party, liberal, glossy version. The Obama childhood is very bizarre. The fact that is who ended up being the president of the United States is very, very strange. Someone born in Hawaii, whose parents are bankers in Hawaii, then goes to Indonesia. His father is a Kenyan guy who is... Barack Obama is not an ordinary person in the United States. He's not. He's a strange, strange individual. The Barack Obama story is very, very, very strange. Look at Barack Obama and who he is. He's not a descendant of slaves. He's not a typical African American who's descended from slaves, right? That's the black nation of the United States. People whose ancestors were brought to this country in chains, worked on plantations, eventually got freed after the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, etc. That's not who Barack Obama is. Barack Obama is the result of a marriage between a white woman in Hawaii and a Kenyan guy who was here on a scholarship. It's a strange story, folks. Barack Obama is a really strange story. And I wish more people had paid attention to it at the time that he was president. Wish I had paid more attention to it. That's one of my regrets, right? I was so worked up and being mad at the right wing and their anti-communist frenzy. I wasn't really paying attention to what was really going on. Barack Obama is one of the strangest things I've ever seen. The more you look into Barack Obama's life story, the more weird and weird and weird and really, really, really weird it gets. Barack Obama is a strange historical moment. Not a typical president of the United States, I'll tell you that much. Well, he did go to Harvard, right? That's normal. That's about it. It's a strange story. But there you go. So, folks, I'm going to wrap it up here. I appreciate you all joining me on a Saturday afternoon in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. We had a great time. We're all friends here. My best wishes to you. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. And I will end by first reminding you that if you're in Rhode Island, come to our book event at Community Cafe. And shout out to Joel, who's doing a great job organizing the event. If you're in New York City, come to our class series that begins. It'll be every Thursday, starting September 12th. And on top of that, on top of all of that, I will end by reciting the last official statement of Mao Zedong. Ever since World War II, the U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the peoples of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And the final part, while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. I love you all. Thank you, Space Communist, for that super chat. My best wishes to you. Glad you're here with us. Peace on earth, goodwill toward man. Have a good evening. I'm out.